The conference room smelled like carpet cleaner and recycled air. My father was already seated when I walked in. He had his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, the way he always did when he thought he was the smartest person in the room. He glanced at me with the expression of a man who had already spent the money. He hadn't. But to understand what happened at that table, you need to know who I was before I walked through that door. My name is Dana Holcomb. I was 28 years old when this started, and I was a staff sergeant assigned to the 304th Military Intelligence Battalion at Fort Campbell, Kentucky. My job was signals intelligence analysis, which meant I spent my working days finding patterns in noise, identifying what people were trying to hide, and writing reports that had to be right the first time because the people reading them were making decisions in real time. I had been in the Army for 6 years. I re-enlisted twice, not because I had no other options, but because I was good at it, and because I believed in finishing what I started. My first deployment was to Kuwait. My second was a 9-month rotation to Iraq that ended in March of 2022. I came home to an apartment in Clarksville, Tennessee that smelled like nobody had opened a window in 9 months, which it hadn't. I aired it out, did 4 loads of laundry, and ate a pulled pork sandwich from a gas station 2 miles from Post. It was the best thing I had eaten in 9 months, and I say that without irony. My father, Robert Holcomb, was a real estate developer in Nashville. He had been in the business for 30 years and had built or sold hundreds of properties across Middle Tennessee. He was the kind of man who wore his financial success the way other people wear cologne. You knew it was there within 30 seconds of meeting him. He drove a dark blue Mercedes he replaced every 3 years. He had opinions about wine and said them out loud at restaurants. I want to be precise about who he was to me before all of this, because I think precision is what I owe you. He was not a cruel man. He was a charming man, which is different and sometimes worse. He had a way of making you feel like you were the only person in the room. I had spent my entire childhood trying to earn that feeling. I think on some level I never quite stopped. My grandmother, his mother, was named Eunice Holcomb. She was 83 when she died, in January of 2022, while I was still deployed. She had lived in the same 4-bedroom farmhouse outside of Gallatin, Tennessee, for 61 years. Her own parents had built it in 1946. The cedar paneling in the hallway had absorbed 60 years of her, and even the last time I visited, 2 years before she died, I walked in and smelled cedar and coffee and something underneath that was just her, and I stood in the doorway for a moment before I could say hello. She left the house to me and my father jointly. That is the phrase in the will. Jointly and in equal shares. She knew my father was already wealthy. She knew I was not. I believe she wanted to give me something solid. Something with cedar paneling and 6 acres and decades of paid property taxes and no one who could take it away. I had no reason to think anything was wrong. That was the problem. My grandmother's death was the first thing in 6 years that broke my concentration at work. Not badly, not visibly, but I was thinking about her when I should have been thinking about other things. I know this because I wrote a report 2 days after she died that my commanding officer sent back for revision, and that had not happened before. I mention it because it matters later. I was not entirely present in those weeks. My father knew I was not entirely present. My brother Marcus was 3 years older than me and had worked for my father's development company since he graduated from Belmont University. He lived in Brentwood, 20 minutes from my father's office. He called me twice during the deployment, which was more than usual for Marcus, and both times he asked how I was holding up with Grandma passing. He did not mention the estate. He did not mention the deed. He did not mention anything about the property at all. I thought he just wasn't involved. I had the shape of that wrong. My father called me twice in March of that year, which was unusual. He was not a calling-in kind of father. He asked about my redeployment timeline, when exactly I would be home. I thought he was being attentive. He asked whether the estate attorney had contacted me yet, and I said I hadn't heard anything, and he said he would look into it. I was in the middle of a 16-hour shift. I needed to get back to my screen. I told him I trusted him to handle it. Those exact words. I trusted him to handle it. He emailed in April to ask about the property. Sell, hold, or rent. I said, let's talk when I'm home. I'll be back in 60 days. He replied that sounded perfect. That email is still in my inbox. I found out later that while I was typing that reply, he was already on the phone with a notary. I got home on the 24th of March, 2022. The first weeks were ordinary. My father texted to welcome me back and said we should have dinner, and I said yes, soon. 3 weeks after landing, I got a letter from a man named Gerald Ash, who identified himself as my grandmother's estate attorney in Gallatin. He had been trying to reach my father about estate matters and had not gotten a response, and was writing to me as co-beneficiary. I called Gerald Ash the next morning. He had a careful, measured way of speaking, the kind that comes from 30 years of delivering information people don't want to receive. When I gave him my name, he paused for a moment. Then he said, Ms. Holcomb, can you tell me what you understand your interest in the Gallatin property to be? I said 50%, jointly held with my father, per the will. He said, I see. He said it the way people say something when they need an extra moment. Then he told me that a quitclaim deed had been filed with Sumner County in April of 2022, transferring my interest in the property to my father. The deed bore my signature. I had not signed any deed. My hands went cold from the inside, not from the temperature of the room, something more interior, like circulation had been redirected somewhere urgent. I was sitting at my kitchen table in Clarksville with a cup of coffee going lukewarm in front of me, and I looked at the grain of the wood for a moment before I spoke. I asked him to repeat the date. April 17th, 2022. I had been in Kuwait. I thanked Gerald Ash and told him I would call him back. Then I sat very still for approximately 4 minutes. I was calculating, not grieving. I have been trained to separate those two activities, and in that moment the training held. I called my father. He answered on the second ring, voice warm the way it always was, and said, Dana, I was just thinking about you. We need to do that dinner. I said, tell me about the Gallatin deed. The warmth left his voice slowly, like a window fogging over. He said, I wanted to talk to you about that. Things moved faster with the estate than I expected. I said, I didn't sign that document. There was a pause. Then he said, you were deployed, Donna. You weren't available. Someone had to make the decision. I want to be clear about what that sentence did, not emotionally but structurally. It told me he had already prepared his position. He had thought about how to frame this, and the frame he had chosen was that my property was an administrative inconvenience created by my absence. As if the issue were logistics, as if the issue were me. I said, we'll talk in person, and I ended the call. I called Gerald Ash back. He gave me the name of the notary who had witnessed the deed, a man named Terry Bevins, who worked out of a strip mall in Hendersonville. I wrote down the name. Then I pulled up the Sumner County property records online. I found the deed. I found my name on a document I had never held in my life. And then, while I was searching the same parcel number, I found a second filing, a deed of trust, dated 6 weeks after the quitclaim. My father had used the farmhouse as collateral for a home equity line of credit, $240,000, borrowed against the house my grandmother had spent 61 years in. He had not just taken my half of the property, he had borrowed against all of it. I drove to the Kroger on Fort Campbell Boulevard. I don't know exactly why. I sat in the parking lot for a while, engine running, and I thought, he has no idea what he just did, and I was going to let him keep not knowing, for a while. Now, at this point, I want to be honest about where I was. I did not have a plan. I had a name, a date, a deed, and something cold and precise behind my sternum that I recognized from years of work. The particular quiet that comes right before you move. I had been trained, specifically and repeatedly, for situations where panic costs more than it buys. I knew how to sit with a fact and let it tell me what to do next. What I did not know yet was how far back this went. I thought I understood the full shape of the problem. I had the shape wrong. There was something I had not found yet, and when I found it, it was going to change what this story was actually about. I spent the first 2 days doing nothing except collecting information, not acting on it, just collecting it. I pulled my deployment orders and printed the records showing I had been at Ali Al Salem Air Base in Kuwait from March 3rd through April 29th of 2022. April 17th, the date on the deed, I had been in a secured intelligence facility. I had a badge swipe record placing me there at 0700 hours. I set those documents in a folder and labeled the folder. I drove to the Sumner County Register of Deeds office in Gallatin on a Tuesday morning. The building had the specific smell of places that have been doing the same work for a long time. Municipal carpet, old paper, fluorescent light. I asked to see the filed instrument for the quitclaim deed on the parcel at my grandmother's address. The clerk printed it without looking up. I sat in a plastic chair in the waiting area and looked at my signature. I have a distinctive way of writing the H in Holcomb. My drill sergeant made a comment about it back in 2016, said it looked like a little fence, and I have never been able to unsee it since. The signature on the deed had an H that was round, smooth, unremarkable. A signature constructed by someone who had seen my name written out and tried to reproduce it without ever watching me hold a pen. I photographed the document. I photographed the notary stamp. Terry Bevins, commission number, expiration date of 2023. That afternoon I called Gerald Ash and asked whether he could recommend an attorney who handled estate fraud in Tennessee. He was quiet for a moment, then he gave me one name, James Pryor. Former lieutenant colonel in the Army Judge Advocate General's Corps, retired after 22 years, private practice in Nashville, estate litigation and fiduciary fraud. Gerald said, underscore, quote, _9, underscore. James Pryor's assistant put me through without a wait. His voice was flat and unhurried, the kind of voice that had already heard everything. I gave him the facts in the order they occurred, no editorializing. When I finished, he was quiet for 4 seconds. Then he said, "The notary is the thread. Pull the notary." He explained that in Tennessee, notaries are required to maintain a journal of every notarial act, the date, the document type, the name of the signer, and the identification presented. If the journal showed my name on April 17th with an identification number that wasn't mine, that was fraud on the notary's part as well. If the journal showed nothing at all, the notarization itself was invalid. Either way, the deed fell apart. He said, "Don't contact the notary directly. Don't contact your father. File nothing. Do nothing that looks like movement. Can you do that?" I said I could. He said, "I figured." That was the closest thing to a compliment he offered in 4 months of working together. Over the following 2 weeks, I pulled every document accessible through public county records. The Sumner County online portal was more thorough than most. I found the deed of trust for the home equity line of credit my father had filed in June, and I found the draw history recorded with the lien. He had already withdrawn $60,000 against the house my grandmother had lived in for 61 years. I labeled a second folder. On a Wednesday, I drove back to the Register of Deeds office. A different clerk was at the counter, a woman in her mid-50s with reading glasses on a beaded chain. Her name tag said Patrice. I asked whether there was a process for flagging potentially fraudulent instrument filings. She looked at me, Then at the document I slid across the counter, then back at me. She said, "Honey, I flagged this one myself in May." She had noticed that the deed listed an address for me that was a Nashville address I had never lived at. She had submitted an internal query to her supervisor in May and never heard back. She photocopied the query form for me, dated and time-stamped, and pushed it across the counter. She said, "I hope you get it sorted." That was the only warmth in an otherwise very cold several weeks, and it mattered more than she knew. My father's attorney called James Pryor 2 weeks later and offered a settlement, $75,000, a release of all claims, and a quitclaim back from my father returning my 50% interest in the property. I rejected it in one sentence. I said the house was not for sale, and I would not be signing any document that involved any further transfer of any interest in it. James Pryor relayed this and told me opposing counsel had gone quiet afterward, which he said could mean several things, and we should move quickly. Then I pulled the notary records, and I saw the date, and I had to sit down. I want to pause here for a moment because at this point, I had everything I needed. Every document, every date, every name. I had built something that could not be argued away. And I remember sitting across from James Pryor in his office on a Tuesday afternoon while he read through the second folder, and he looked up and said, and I'm going to quote him exactly, underscore, underscore, quote underscore 15, underscore, underscore. I understood exactly what he meant. I had been in rooms like that before. I knew what confidence looks like in the seconds before it breaks. And I knew what I had not told them yet was going to do the breaking. I had everything I needed. But I hadn't told them that yet. Now here is the part I have not told you. James Pryor subpoenaed the notary's journal through civil process. Terry Bevins kept a digital journal as required by his bonding company. The journal showed that on November 9, 2021, 14 months before my grandmother died, Terry Bevins had notarized a document for Robert Holcomb. The document type was listed as durable power of attorney, financial and healthcare. My father had obtained a power of attorney over my grandmother's finances while she was still alive. In November of 2021, my grandmother had been 82 years old and in measurable cognitive decline. Gerald Ash confirmed this when I called him. He said she had stopped managing her own mail sometime in early 2021 and had asked him to hold certain documents for safekeeping. He said she had asked him to hold a letter. For me. He had been trying to reach me through contact information my father had provided. That contact information was an email address I had never owned. I want you to understand what that means. For 5 months, my father had been redirecting correspondence from my grandmother's own attorney to an account he controlled. Every time Gerald Ash tried to reach me, the message went somewhere my father could manage. I had never received anything from Gerald Ash until April, because my father had been managing my access to my own grandmother for the last months of her life. James Pryor had a forensic accountant pull the records on my grandmother's financial accounts from the 2 years before her death. It took 3 weeks and a second subpoena. What came back changed the shape of everything. My grandmother had owned a 4-acre parcel adjacent to the farmhouse. Separate deed, separate parcel number, inherited from her own father decades before. In January of 2022, 2 months before she died, that parcel had been transferred out of her name using the power of attorney. It went into a limited liability company registered in Tennessee. The registered agent for that company was Marcus Holcomb, my brother. The attorney went very quiet. I watched him read the transfer document twice. I need you to understand what this document actually meant. My father had obtained a power of attorney while my grandmother was in cognitive decline and used it to transfer property to a company he and my brother controlled before she was dead, before the will was probated, before any estate proceeding existed. That parcel was not in the will because by the time she died, it no longer belonged to her. And my brother, who had called me twice during my deployment to ask how I was holding up, had accepted title to land taken from a dying woman and said nothing to me for over a year. Wait, it gets worse. Gerald's letter, the one my grandmother had asked him to hold for me. James Pryor requested it directly, and Gerald sent it by courier the same day. It was 2 pages, handwritten in my grandmother's looping cursive on her good stationery, the paper with the small blue border she kept in the secretary desk in the cedar hallway. She wrote that she had discovered in the fall of 2021 that money had been moved from her savings account without her authorization. She believed it was my father. She did not have enough left to fight it. She wrote that she had revised her will specifically to include me as a joint owner of the farmhouse so that something of hers would reach me directly, and she wanted me to know why she had done it. She wrote, "Your father is charming, and that is not the same as trustworthy. I should have told you sooner. The house is yours as much as his. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." She had known. She had been trying to warn me for a year, and he had made sure the warning never arrived. But here's what none of them knew. My grandmother had also called Gerald Ashe 3 days before she died and asked him to make a signed, dated note of the letter's contents in his own file, in case anything happened to the letter itself. Gerald had done exactly that. He had a notarized summary sitting in a filing cabinet in Gallatin, Tennessee, for 14 months. Waiting. I had 1 meeting left, and I had been waiting for it since the morning I sat in a Kroger parking lot with the engine running and a cold certainty behind my sternum that was starting to feel, in a very quiet way, like purpose. Everything I had done for the past 3 months came down to 1 room, 1 table, 1 morning. James Pryor told me to let him lead and said I should stay quiet unless he signaled me directly. I told him I understood, and I did understand. I also knew that at a specific moment in that room, I was going to say 1 sentence. I had been composing it for 11 weeks. I knew exactly when to say it. I knew what would happen in the room when I did. We pulled into the parking garage at 8:47 in the morning. I remember looking at my watch and thinking, we're early. Good. The conference room was on the 14th floor of a building on Church Street in Nashville, floor-to-ceiling windows on the east wall, morning light coming in flat and white, a long mahogany table with 8 chairs, a credenza along one wall with a coffee service nobody touched. The carpet was the specific shade of charcoal that expensive law firms use because it does not show anything. I was wearing my Class A uniform, every brass piece polished the night before. I want to be clear that this was a deliberate choice, not performance, not sentiment, but information. I wanted my father to look at me and understand that I had spent 6 years becoming something he had not accounted for. He was already seated when James Pryor and I walked in. Marcus was beside him, 2 seats down, not making eye contact with the door. My father's attorney, a man named Dennis Calhoun, who billed at $400 an hour and had the professional smoothness of someone who had seen a great deal of other people's ugliness, stood to shake James Pryor's hand. My father looked at me. His eyes went from my face to my uniform to the folder I was carrying. His expression did not change. He was practiced at expressions not changing. Dennis Calhoun opened. He summarized the situation with the kind of brisk confidence that tells you a man believes the conversation will be short. He said the quitclaim deed had been executed pursuant to a valid power of attorney delegating authority from me to my father during my deployment, that this was a standard and legally recognized instrument, and that any estate dispute would be most efficiently resolved through the settlement already proposed. James Pryor let him finish. Then he said, "We'll get to that. Ms. Holcomb, the floor is yours." I opened the folder. I did not narrate what was inside it. I did not explain. I took the documents out in order, placed them flat on the table, and pushed the stack toward the center. Deployment records on top, badge swipe logs from Ali Al-Salem, dated April 17th. Below that, The Notary Journal subpoena response, showing Terry Bevins, had no journal entry corresponding to my signature. Below that, the forensic document examiner's written analysis of the signature discrepancy, 7 pages, bound with a binder clip. I set my hands flat on the table and looked at Dennis Calhoun. The room was quiet for approximately 5 seconds. Dennis Calhoun picked up the top document. He read the first page. He set it down and picked up the notary analysis. He read 2 paragraphs. He put it down. My father was looking at the table. Marcus was looking at his hands. I slid a second set of documents toward the center. The power of attorney filed in November 2021. The parcel transfer into Marcus's limited liability company, dated January 2022. The forensic accounting summary of withdrawals from my grandmother's accounts during the 18 months prior to her death. And on top of everything else, a certified copy of Gerald Ash's notarized file note summarizing the letter my grandmother had asked him to document, dated 3 days before she died. Dennis Calhoun read the file note. He set it down very carefully. He picked up the parcel transfer. He looked at Marcus. It was a brief look, professional and opaque, but I had spent 6 years reading brief looks, and what it said was, "You did not tell me about this." My father said, "Dana." He said it the way he had said my name my entire life, with a particular quality of patience, as if I were about to misunderstand something simple. "This is a family matter. It can be resolved as a family." That was the moment. I said, "She knew what you were doing. She wrote it down. She made sure there was a record." I said it quietly. I was looking at him when I said it. I watched him understand that the letter existed, that the file note existed, that the documentation chain went back further than he had believed it could go. The expression on his face did not break all at once. It receded, like water pulling back from a shore before something larger comes. Dennis Calhoun set the documents down and said, "I'd like to request a brief recess." James Pryor said, "Of course." He and I walked to the hallway. James Pryor said nothing. He refilled his coffee from a cart near the elevator bank. I stood by the window and looked at the Cumberland River 11 blocks south, moving the way rivers do, with complete indifference to what was happening on the 14th floor of a building on Church Street. When we went back in, Dennis Calhoun said they were prepared to discuss a full restoration of the property interest, return of all funds withdrawn under the power of attorney, and dissolution of the limited liability company holding the adjacent parcel. No cash settlement, no release of claims unless all transfers were unwound completely. James Pryor looked at me. I said, "That's the floor, not the ceiling." It took 3 more weeks of paperwork. But that was the meeting. I walked to the parking garage alone while James Pryor finished the procedural discussion. I took the elevator to level 3 where we had parked, and I stood next to my car for a moment. I did not cry. I did not feel the specific release people describe in moments like this. What I felt was closer to the end of a very long shift, when your body finally acknowledges it has been holding a posture for hours, and you did not notice until you stopped. I took off my uniform jacket and folded it over the passenger seat. I sat in the car and ate a granola bar I had brought because I had not eaten breakfast. Then I drove back to Clarksville. The deed was restored in Sumner County records 41 days after the meeting. My 50% interest, my name, back in the parcel record where it had always been meant to be. The adjacent parcel was returned to the estate and folded into the settlement. My father's home equity line was his to resolve. His problem, his collateral, his lender's patience to exhaust. The Tennessee Department of Commerce and Insurance opened a disciplinary proceeding against Terry Bevins. He surrendered his commission without contest. What happened to him after that, I don't know and don't particularly need to. My father did not lose his development business. He lost $60,000 in settlement funds, and he lost the home equity line, and he lost something harder to name, the version of himself he had been able to maintain in his own story. I do not know how he carries that. I no longer consider it my problem. Marcus called me once, about 6 weeks after the meeting. He met me at a diner outside of Gallatin, 15 minutes from the farmhouse. He was already there when I arrived, sitting in a booth by the window, looking smaller than I remembered him looking. He had ordered coffee and was turning the mug in circles on the table. He said, "I didn't know about the forgery." I said, "I know." He said, "I should have told you about the deed. The other one." I said, "Yes." He said, "I thought he was going to cut me out if I said anything." I looked at him for a long time. He looked like someone waiting to be told whether they were still a person he was allowed to call his sister. I did not tell him. I said I needed some time, and I paid for my coffee, and I left. We have not spoken since. I think about that booth sometimes, not with grief exactly, but with the particular weight of a door you have walked away from that you are not sure you will ever go back through. James Pryor called me the day the deed was recorded. He said, "Certified copy is in the mail." Then he said, "Your grandmother would have liked how you handled yourself." I said, "I think she already knew I would." He said, "I think she did too." And that was the end of the call. There is a cedar branch I keep on my kitchen windowsill. I cut it from the tree at the edge of the farmhouse property the first time I went back after the deed was restored. It has dried out now, gone gray and smooth, but it still carries something in it, some faint trace of that smell, cedar and cold air and the particular quiet of 6 acres in the middle of winter. I look at it most mornings when I am making coffee. It is 2 years later now. I live 40 minutes from Gallatin. I have put in the paperwork to rent the farmhouse through a property management company, and the first tenants moved in last month. They sent a message saying the cedar paneling in the hallway was the reason they chose it. I read that message twice. I am still in the Army. I have 17 months left on my current contract, and I have not decided yet what comes after. There are mornings when I drive to post before the sun is fully up and the fields on either side of the highway are still dark, and I think about what my grandmother wrote, that charm is not the same as trustworthy, and that she should have told me sooner. I think she underestimated how much I already knew. I think she just wanted me to hear her say it. My father had built a 30-year career on understanding what things were worth before other people did. He looked at my life, my service record, my military paycheck, and he calculated that I was a manageable variable. He thought the absence made me small. He had never watched me work. There's one more thing I haven't told you. The cedar branch. I almost left it there, that first day back at the farmhouse. I stood at the tree for a while, looking at it, and then I cut one piece and put it in my coat pocket. I don't know exactly why I kept it. I think I wanted something from that place that had not been touched by any of this. Something that had just kept growing, indifferent to deeds and signatures, and men who confuse silence with weakness. It sits on my windowsill, gray and quiet, exactly where I put it. If any of this sounds familiar, I would genuinely want to hear about it in the comments below. And if you want to know what happened with the farmhouse tenants, and with one other conversation I have not had yet, there is more to this story.